Put them all together, you get the organism, and that is primarily you. I don't know that I have a whole lot more to say about that other than why do I need the organism? Why can't some of these organ systems work on their own? Well, your body is completely interrelated, and all of the organ systems sort of require or depend on the other organ systems to keep you alive. And keeping you alive is the process of maintaining homeostasis, the things necessary for the environment inside your body to sort of stay the same. So when you get hot, what do? Yeah, you sweat to try to cool off the body to get it back to the normal temperature. If your body gets too hot, 104, 105, long-term exposure to those temperatures will cause your brain to start to die. So it's very important that you stay within a narrow range of homeostasis so that your body can function. So stay out of Phoenix. Anything else? I don't think so. So we'll go from this to what does it mean to be alive? Well, if you want to be part of the biology department, you need to know what is alive. And if you're looking at going into some sort of health occupation, then keeping the patient alive is of importance to you. How do you know if something is alive? Well, the smallest individual item on the planet that is alive is a single cell. And then because things are made of cells, then anything that's made from many, many, many cells is also considered alive. And we refer to them as organisms. So the fundamental premise of life is that it is made of cells. Those cells did not arrive spontaneously. The cells divided and created more. So anything is alive when it's made of a cell or many cells. And we know that anytime a cell shows up, that it came from a cell that divided. So that's the main premise of what constitutes an item that can be alive. But not all items that are created of cells are alive. They may have died. So they also have to have these 6 things. Metabolism. You have the ability to create energy from food items. So you take food in and you do catabolism. You break that food down into its individual components, and then you take those individual components and you do anabolism and you create you out of it. So it's not like you eat a carrot and then you take those carrot pieces and make a finger that looks orange and acts like a carrot. You're going to take those carrot pieces and you're going to break them down into the individual molecules, and you're going to rearrange those molecules into molecules that constitute you. If metabolism is not occurring, then likely only catabolism is occurring and you're breaking down, you're decomposing. And so when you start to die, or when you die, you start to decompose. Responsiveness, this is requiring a signal or a stimulus. Stimulus is applied to the item, and when that stimulus is applied, there is a reaction to it. So anything that is alive has got to respond to the stimuli within its environment. The responses might be different, but there is something that happens as a result of the stimulus. Movement. Anything that is alive is going to cause movement. You are either going to see the organism move through the environment, and those organisms that are alive but don't move through the environment, like a tree, are still going to cause movement of materials up and down through the xylem and the phloem between the roots and the leaves. So some sort of movement has to be occurring. Growth. Anything that is alive is going to grow, and that is going to be either the size of the objects gets bigger, or you're allowing for growth for the replacement of things that are lost. So every day I lose hundreds of thousands of skin cells. Growth must take place so that I still have skin. If it didn't, my skin would die, slough off, and then where would I be? So I have to have growth, and then that is pretty much closely tied to reproduction, because cells have to divide, and part of that is the growth of the cell to get larger so that it can divide, so that it can replace the cells that are lost. Or reproduction may actually be me creating another person, something that I can't do alone. It has to be done in cooperation with another person. And then differentiation. Differentiation, I've used this term before when we were talking about development. We all start out as a single cell. That single cell has the genetic information so that some genes can be turned off, some genes can be turned on, and when they do, I can create vastly different cells. And so differentiation is essentially the control of gene expression. And by controlling gene expression, then I can create vastly different cells, which then can create vastly different tissues, and those vastly different tissues can come together to form vastly different organs. So without differentiation, I'm sort of stuck. The last thing that we want to look at is an overview of the human body and some of the different cavities. So here's the overview of my human body. I'm going to use my backbone, or as my spine, as a landmark. Mid-sagittal plane runs down my spine, and I get two equal halves. And so I can use the backbone or the spine as a landmark in correlation with my median plane, and this gives me a place to start. So understanding that the human body has a backbone, we're vertebrates, this is an important principle that we can use to then try to help us understand different areas or different regions within the body. You are a tube within a tube. The outside of your body is sort of tubular with a couple of things hanging off from it. Inside this tube, there is another tube that runs from my mouth to my anus, and that is going to be where I put food and conduct food through my body, where it's going to be processed, and then I'm going to allow for absorption. So there's definitely a tube within the tube of my body. This tube is not straight, of course, it's twisting around and all that kind of stuff. You are bilaterally symmetrical. That goes back to your spine and also our discussion of the mid-sagittal plane. And then you can divide the body into two regions, and we've already talked about them a little bit, although this is a sort of a different way to define it. Axial, that's anything on the main body axis. That includes your head, your neck, and your trunk. Then attached to that, you have the appendicular skeleton. Appendicular because they're appendages, they're attached to the main body. And that's going to be your upper and lower limbs and the bones and the muscles that are used to attach those appendages to your body. Regions. We've already talked a little bit about the regions. I showed you a picture of the 9 regions on your abdomen, and we named a few: epigastric, umbilical, and hypogastric. You'll make sure that you go through and you know all of those regions. Make sure you can identify an organ in those regions. You can either do that by reading through the textbook, or you can use it by looking at the picture and identifying organs within the regions that are pictured there. Regions are very precise, and they're used when you have time to be precise. But sometimes there's an emergency and you can't be precise. So if you can't be as precise as a region, you will use a quadrant. And you basically take and you draw an X. This is your belly button. And then you're going to have 4 spaces. 4 is quadrant. And so you have an upper right quadrant, an upper left quadrant, a right lower quadrant, and a lower left quadrant. These are larger areas than the regions, but still they're going to be enough to sort of direct people to where the problem might be. And so make sure you take a look at the quadrants. Again, using the picture, you can see that the right upper quadrant is filled primarily by the liver. So that might be something to look at. Then just underneath the liver, you're going to have the gallbladder hanging off. And then left upper quadrant, we do have a piece of the left lobe of the liver over there, but it's dominated by the stomach. Then we've got the spleen back here. Transverse colon is going between both of those quadrants. And then right lower quadrant, the appendix is over here typically. We got half the bladder, we've got half the small intestine. If you're female, then you'll have an ovary over here. And left lower quadrant, you'll have another ovary over here. And then once again, you've got the sigmoid colon, you've got half the small intestine, and you've got half the bladder. So quadrants are not as precise as regions. You would use this in the emergency room where you don't have time, you're just trying to direct people to an area. If you have more time and the person may not be as in critical condition, then you might switch to the regions, and then you might talk about hypochondriac region, right or left, epigastric region, and so on and so forth. But once again, make sure that you go into the textbook and you can identify the regions, and the homework will give you practice with this until you sort of get the hang of things. Position, anatomical position is this. This person is in anatomical position. The palms are facing forward, the arms are down by the side, and the person's on their flat feet, and they're standing and looking at you. So, anatomical position. We use this position when we're talking about any of the directional terms. So, make sure you get familiar with this position. This is what is used in Western medicine to identify where an area is located. But then, critically important with that is you need to know the terms that are used to direct a person to that area. So let's take a quick gander at this. Superior and inferior. These are probably something that you're somewhat familiar with because we do use them in everyday life. Superior and inferior is going to be primarily used when you're looking at the axial skeleton and you are using a horizontal or transverse plane, and then upper or lower. So, for instance, my neck is superior to my sternum. Anterior is the same thing as ventral. They're used interchangeably. And then you have posterior and you have dorsal. Now, preferentially, when you're talking about things in the nervous system, you're going to use ventral and dorsal. That's preferential. You can see many examples in the nervous system where they still use anterior and posterior, but it is still preferred to use ventral and dorsal when you're talking about the spinal cord and the nervous system. Anterior and posterior you can use anywhere else. So anterior is when you are using the coronal plane and you've divided the body into a front and back. And of course, anterior is anything in the front, and then posterior is anything in the back. So you might say that the ribs are anterior to the lungs. And you could also say, let's see, what's something that, the gluteus maximus is posterior to the pelvis. Medial and lateral. Medial is anything that is closer to the body's midline. Lateral is anything that's far away. So as you do the mid-sagittal plane, medial would be anything that's closer to the mid-sagittal plane. Lateral would be anything that's farther away. So the belly button or the umbilicus would be medial to the hip. And so anytime you want to talk about things that are closer or farther from the mid-sagittal plane, you're going to use medial and lateral. Ipsilateral and contralateral, I already gave you an example of that. You're using the mid-sagittal plane Anything on the same side of that plane is ipsilateral. Anything on the opposite sides is going to be contralateral. Proximal and distal, these are extremely important terms that you use with the appendages, the upper and lower limbs. If I am proximal, I am closer. If I am distal, I am farther away. So the elbow is proximal to the thumb. You can use proximal and distal also when you're talking about organ systems. Anything that is proximal is closer to the beginning of the organ system. And then superficial and deep is another way of doing anterior and posterior, but it is more precise. So superficial is closer to the surface of the body, deep is deeper within the body. So the skin is superficial, but the muscles are going to be deep to the skin. Parietal and visceral deals with things that are attached either to the body wall, parietal, or visceral, they're attached to an organ. So this is used primarily within the reference of the membranes that are covering the organs. If the membrane covers the organ, then it is visceral. If it covers the body wall, then it is going to be parietal. Intermediate is just between. So the sternum is between the breasts, and intermediate is anything that's between two other objects. So those are the anatomical position and the directional terms that we use. Again, extremely important so that you know how to direct people, and if somebody directs you with these terms, then you actually end up in the right place. This is going to be something that you're going to use throughout anatomy and then beyond anatomy.